The Intergalactic University of Advanced Sciences had always prided itself on being the pinnacle of intellectual achievement across 7 star systems. Its crystalline spires stretched toward the binary suns of Nexus Prime, housing the most brilliant minds the galaxy had to offer. Well, mostly brilliant. Today's annual Species Behavioral Analysis Conference was about to test that claim in ways the administration would later wish they could forget. Dr. Nora Whitfield adjusted her presentation tablet and surveyed the amphitheater with the kind of smile that made wise people check their wallets. The venue itself was a marvel of architectural pretension. Holographic displays floated between marble columns that had been imported from a planet whose primary export was looking expensive. The assembled audience represented the cream of xenobiological research, which meant they possessed the combined ego mass of a small moon and roughly equivalent social skills. At the podium's center sat Dean Zethros, a Valdarian whose species had evolved from something resembling a praying mantis crossed with a tax auditor. His compound eyes glittered with the kind of academic smugness that suggested he'd never encountered a concept he couldn't categorize, file, and subsequently dismiss. The dean's tenure had been marked by his unwavering belief that proper scientific discourse required at least 3 syllables per word and a complete absence of anything resembling humor. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities," Zethros announced, his voice carrying the nasal quality that all Valdarians seem to cultivate for formal occasions. "Today, we examine the behavioral patterns of various species across our galactic community. We shall, as always, approach these topics with the rigorous methodology and intellectual precision that separates us from the lesser civilizations." The assembled academics nodded with the synchronized enthusiasm of people who'd heard this speech annually for the past decade. Among them sat representatives from the Zephian Collective, whose blue-skinned intellectuals had mastered the art of looking thoughtful while thinking about lunch. The crystalline hegemony had sent their finest mineral-based consciousness, who communicated through light patterns that roughly translated to academic jargon. Even the hive-mind confederacy had bothered to attend, though their delegate spent most meetings arguing with himself in 17 different voices. Nora represented humanity's first and likely last invitation to this particular gathering. Her credentials were impeccable: 3 degrees in xenobiology, published research on interspecies communication, and a talent for making complex concepts accessible to the masses. That last qualification had earned her more enemies in academic circles than her tendency to point out when the Emperor's new theories were, scientifically speaking, buck naked. "Dr. Whitfield," Zethros continued, consulting his holographic notes with the care of someone handling radioactive material, "your proposed presentation on human domestic partnerships was unconventional." The review board expressed concerns about the relevance of such a topic to serious xenobiological discourse. The subtle emphasis on serious wasn't lost on anyone present. Humanity's reputation in academic circles had suffered from their species' unfortunate tendency to name things after their discoverers, their insistence on using measurement systems that made no mathematical sense, and their habit of drawing smiley faces on official documents. The fact that humans had somehow managed to become a spacefaring civilization despite these obvious character flaws remained a source of galactic bewilderment. "I appreciate the committee's concerns," Nora replied, her tone carrying just enough respect to be technically polite while suggesting she'd rather gargle with antimatter than explain herself to this particular audience. "However, I believe that understanding human domestic relationships provides crucial insights into our species' behavioral patterns and survival strategies." Dr. Helix Mortensen, a Zephyrian whose research focused on what he generously termed primitive social structures, leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd found a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. "Surely, Dr. Whitfield, human domestic arrangements follow standard evolutionary patterns? Resource sharing, reproductive partnerships, offspring protection, the usual biological imperatives?" "Oh, absolutely," Nora agreed, her smile widening in a way that should have triggered every survival instinct in the room. "Human domestic partnerships are indeed about protection, resource sharing, and complex social bonds. we'll be examining several specific examples of how humans choose to share their living spaces with other species. The audience settled back with the satisfied air of academics who'd successfully pigeonholed a topic before it could threaten their worldview. This was familiar territory. Interspecies cooperation for mutual benefit, probably involving some form of agricultural symbiosis or waste management efficiency. Safe, predictable, and thoroughly documented across dozens of civilizations. Professor Axiom Slate, the crystalline hegemony's representative, pulsed with patterns that translated roughly to academic approval. A comparative analysis of symbiotic relationships across species barriers, most illuminating. I assume you'll be focusing on the standard categories: nutrient exchange, environmental modification, defensive partnerships, something like that, Nora confirmed, making a note on her tablet, though I think you'll find human approaches to these relationships are somewhat unique. The word unique in academic circles typically meant weird but harmless, like the Plutonian tendency to conduct all research while standing on one leg, or the Andromedan practice of peer review through interpretive dance. The assembled scholars prepared themselves for an hour of mildly amusing anthropological oddities, the kind of presentation that would provide cocktail party conversation for months without challenging any fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilization. Dean Zethros consulted his chronometer, a device that measured time in 17 different planetary standards, because apparently regular time wasn't prestigious enough. "Very well, Dr. Whitfield. You have precisely 53 minutes to present your findings. Please ensure your conclusions align with established xenobiological frameworks." Nora's smile could have powered a small research station. "Oh, I'm sure they will. After all, what could be more natural than examining the ways different species learn to coexist?" The irony, of course, was that every single being in that amphitheater considered themselves an expert on interspecies relationships. They'd spent decades studying, cataloging, and theorizing about how different life forms could share space, resources, and mutual benefits. They'd written papers on symbiosis, published treatises on cooperative evolution, and delivered lectures on the fundamental principles governing successful cross-species partnerships. None of them had ever considered that some species might approach these relationships with the kind of enthusiastic disregard for personal safety that characterized humanity's approach to most challenges. In approximately 47 minutes, that oversight would result in the most spectacular academic meltdown in the university's recorded history. But for now, they sat in comfortable ignorance, prepared to be mildly entertained by whatever quaint human customs Dr. Whitfield had discovered in her research. The dean straightened his ceremonial robes, the audience settled into their seats, and Nora Whitfield stepped up to the podium with the confidence of someone who was about to fundamentally reshape galactic perspectives on what constituted reasonable behavior. The presentation that would become known as the Bear Incident was about to begin. Nora activated her holographic display with the casual confidence of someone who'd never met a comfortable silence she couldn't shatter. The first image materialized above the podium, a bucolic scene of rolling green hills dotted with what appeared to be primitive agricultural structures. The assembled academics leaned forward with the polite interest of beings who'd seen variations of this presentation across 47 different civilizations. "Human domestic partnerships," Nora began, her voice carrying the kind of measured authority that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment in her bathroom mirror, represent a fascinating deviation from standard interspecies cooperation models. Unlike most galactic civilizations, humans don't limit their domestic arrangements to members of their own species. Professor Axiom Slate pulsed with crystalline patterns that roughly translated to scholarly approval. This was textbook stuff. Agricultural societies often developed symbiotic relationships with local fauna for pest control, waste management, or transportation. The hegemony had documented similar arrangements across 16 star systems. "Our first example," Nora continued, gesturing to the hologram, "involves a species humans have lived alongside for approximately 9,000 years. Meet the common house cat." The image shifted to show a small, furry creature with pointed ears and what could generously be described as a judgmental expression. To the alien academics, it looked like a standard example of domesticated livestock, Compact, manageable, probably useful for some form of rodent control. Dr. Helix Mortensen nodded approvingly. Ah, yes. A classic agricultural partnership. I assume these cats provide pest management services in exchange for shelter and nutrition? Well, Nora said, her smile acquiring the kind of edge that suggested the next few minutes would be educational in ways the audience hadn't anticipated. That's certainly one interpretation, though it's worth noting that cats are obligate carnivores with retractable claws, night vision, and reflexes fast enough to catch flying prey mid-air. The temperature in the amphitheater seemed to drop a few degrees. Dr. Mortensen's blue skin took on a slightly greenish tinge as he processed this information. Carnivores with weapons? Natural weapons, Nora corrected helpfully. 20 razor-sharp claws, teeth designed for tearing flesh, and the hunting instincts of an apex predator. Humans invite them into their homes, allow them to sleep in their beds, and often permit them unrestricted access to their offspring. The Hivemind Confederacy's delegate began arguing with himself in increasingly agitated tones. His primary consciousness insisted this was obviously some form of mistranslation, while his secondary awareness pointed out that humans had a documented history of making spectacularly poor survival decisions. Dean Zethros's compound eyes focused with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex mathematical equation. Dr. Whitfield, are you suggesting that humans deliberately cohabitate with predatory species? Oh, absolutely, Nora replied with the enthusiasm of someone describing their favorite hobby. In fact, cats kill approximately 1 billion small animals annually in North America alone. Humans are fully aware of this and consider it charming. Many households maintain multiple cats simultaneously. The hologram shifted to show a living room scene where several cats lounged on furniture that probably cost more than most civilizations' annual research budgets. One particularly smug-looking specimen had claimed an entire sofa, while another perched on a bookshelf with the casual arrogance of a species that had never doubted its own superiority. But surely, Professor Slate pulsed in patterns that suggested academic distress. These creatures serve some vital function that justifies the obvious risks? Nora's expression suggested she'd been hoping someone would ask that question. Cats provide companionship, stress relief, and what humans term emotional support. In exchange, humans provide food, medical care, and entertainment. It's essentially a protection racket, except the humans are paying willingly. Entertainment? Dr. Mortensen's voice had risen to a pitch that suggested imminent panic. What kind of entertainment? Laser pointers, mostly. Humans spend considerable time and resources creating elaborate games for creatures that could theoretically kill them in their sleep. There's an entire industry devoted to manufacturing toys for domestic predators. The audience was beginning to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't following the expected pattern of agricultural symbiosis. This sounded like a species that had collectively decided that sharing their living space with armed carnivores was a reasonable lifestyle choice. Moving on, Nora continued, advancing to the next slide with the merciless efficiency of someone who'd planned this presentation like a military campaign. Let's examine humanity's relationship with canines. The new image showed a creature roughly twice the size of the cat, with prominent teeth and what appeared to be a permanently aggressive expression. Several academics made soft noises of distress. Dogs, Nora explained, are descended from wolves, pack hunters capable of bringing down prey many times their size. Humans have been living with them for over 15,000 years, during which time they've selectively bred them for various traits including size, aggression, and hunting ability. The Hivemind delegate's 17 voices had synchronized into what sounded like a collective whimper. Pack hunters? In their homes? Not just in their homes, Nora clarified. Humans take dogs on walks through populated areas, often without restraints. They allow children to play with them unsupervised. Some breeds have been specifically developed to be capable of killing adult humans, and these are often preferred as family pets. Dean Zethros was making rapid calculations on his tablet, probably trying to determine how a species this apparently suicidal had managed to achieve spaceflight. Dr. Whitfield, this seems less like domestic partnership and more like deliberate courting of death. Ah, we're just getting started, Nora replied with the kind of cheerful optimism that suggested she'd never met a comfortable assumption she couldn't demolish. Let's talk about horses. The hologram now displayed a creature that dwarfed the previous examples, a 1,000-pound mammal with hooves that could crush bone and a flight response that involved kicking first and asking questions later. Several academics were beginning to look genuinely ill. Horses, Nora continued, are prey animals with the strength to kill humans accidentally. They are naturally programmed to flee or fight when startled, and humans routinely climb on their backs for recreation. Children as young as 5 years old are encouraged to participate in this activity. Professor Slate's light patterns had devolved into what could only be described as crystalline screaming. They ride them? Voluntarily? Competitively, Nora confirmed. There are entire sports devoted to humans deliberately placing themselves in positions where they can be thrown, trampled, or kicked by animals that outweigh them by a factor of 10. Olympic medals are awarded for this behavior. The dean was frantically consulting his notes, probably searching for some regulation that would allow him to end this presentation before it caused a diplomatic incident. Unfortunately, academic freedom was a cornerstone of university policy, and Dr. Whitfield was operating well within established guidelines for scholarly discourse. "I think," Dr. Mortensen said carefully, "we may be dealing with a translation error. Surely humans don't deliberately seek out dangerous animals for companionship." Nora's smile could have been classified as a weapon in several star systems. "Oh, but we haven't even discussed the interesting examples yet. Everything I've shown you so far represents the conservative end of human domestic partnerships." The amphitheater had gone completely silent except for the soft sound of several academics hyperventilating. The dean's compound eyes were focused with the intensity of someone who just realized they were standing in a minefield. "Dr. Whitfield," he said slowly, "perhaps we should move to the conclusion of your presentation." "Nonsense," Nora replied, with the kind of academic enthusiasm that had probably started more wars than most people realized. "We haven't even reached the really good part yet. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you about the animals humans keep when they're feeling adventurous." The next slide was already loading, and from the expression on Nora's face, the real education was about to begin. The holographic display flickered to life with an image that made several academics question their life choices. A massive reptilian creature basked under artificial lighting, its scales gleaming with the kind of prehistoric menace that suggested evolution had stopped improving because perfection had already been achieved. "Reptiles," Nora announced, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, "represent humanity's foray into what we might call exotic domestic partnerships. This particular specimen is a Burmese python, capable of growing to 20 feet in length and strong enough to crush adult humans." The crystalline hegemony's representative had stopped pulsing entirely, which in their species typically indicated either deep meditation or complete system failure. Given the circumstances, smart money was on the latter. "Now, you might reasonably assume," Nora continued, advancing to the next slide, "that humans would keep such creatures in secure, professionally monitored facilities. You would be wrong. Many humans maintain these animals in converted bedroom closets, often in residential areas where neighbors remain blissfully unaware that death lives next door." Dean Zethros had begun making notes with the frantic energy of someone documenting the collapse of civilization. "Dr. Whitfield, surely there are regulations governing the containment of such obviously dangerous creatures." "Oh, there are," Nora agreed cheerfully. "They're routinely ignored. In fact, there's an entire subculture of humans who specialize in collecting what they term hot snakes. Venomous species capable of killing with a single bite. They keep them in glass boxes and handle them with tools that would be considered inadequate for managing a household plant in most civilizations." The image shifted to show a human casually manipulating a serpent whose coloration screamed warning in 17 different evolutionary languages. The handler appeared to be smiling, which suggested either remarkable courage or a species-wide neurological defect. "But surely," Professor Slate managed to pulse in patterns that resembled academic desperation, "these are isolated cases. eccentric individuals operating outside normal human social parameters? Nora's expression suggested she'd been hoping someone would provide her with such a perfect setup. Actually, reptile keeping is considered a perfectly mainstream hobby. There are conventions, specialized publications, and breeding programs. Some humans dedicate entire rooms of their homes to housing creatures that could kill them through negligence, malice, or simple accident. The hive mind delegate's 17 voices had devolved into what sounded like a support group for traumatized consciousnesses. His primary awareness was demanding immediate evacuation, while his tertiary thoughts were calculating the statistical probability that any species this reckless could achieve interstellar travel. Moving on, Nora announced, "Let's discuss arachnids." The collective intake of breath that followed this statement would have been audible in the next star system. The hologram now displayed a creature that appeared to be composed entirely of legs, fangs, and evolutionary malice. Its 8 eyes reflected the amphitheater's lights, with the cold intelligence of something that had been perfecting the art of being terrifying for approximately 400 million years. Tarantulas, Nora explained, are popular pets among humans who feel that reptiles don't provide sufficient opportunities for accidental death. These particular specimens can live for decades, grow to the size of dinner plates, and possess both venom and the kind of aggressive territorial instincts that make them excellent conversation pieces. Dr. Mortensen had progressed beyond his earlier greenish pallor to a shade that suggested his species' equivalent of existential crisis. They voluntarily handle creatures with 8 legs and venom? Not just handle, Nora clarified. Some humans allow their tarantulas to roam freely throughout their homes. There are documented cases of owners waking up to find their pets have taken up residence in their bed, their clothing, or their kitchen cabinets. This is generally considered amusing rather than grounds for immediate relocation. The dean was now consulting what appeared to be emergency protocols, probably searching for some regulation that would allow him to declare a mental health crisis and evacuate the building. Unfortunately, Dr. Whitfield was still operating within the bounds of acceptable academic discourse, if one defined acceptable very loosely. Of course, Nora continued, some humans prefer their domestic partners to be more interactive, which brings us to primates. The new image showed a creature that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the audience's preconceptions about primitive intelligence. It was manipulating what appeared to be a complex tool, while regarding the camera with the kind of calculating intelligence that suggested it was planning something that would end poorly for everyone involved. Chimpanzees, Nora announced, share approximately 98% of human DNA and possess the strength to literally tear adult humans apart. They're capable of using tools, solving complex problems, and holding grudges that can last for decades. Naturally, some humans keep them as pets. The amphitheater had gone completely silent, except for the sound of several academics quietly hyperventilating. The dean's compound eyes were focused with the intensity of someone watching a star go supernova. But surely, he managed, there are safeguards in place, professional supervision, specialized training. You'd think so, Nora replied, with the kind of cheerful optimism that suggested she'd never met a comfortable assumption she couldn't incinerate. However, many primate owners are amateur enthusiasts who've learned their husbandry techniques from online forums and social media. There are documented cases of pet chimpanzees attacking their owners' friends, and random passers-by who had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Professor Slate's light patterns had devolved into what could only be described as crystalline sobbing. But why? What possible benefit could justify such obvious risks? Companionship, Nora explained. Emotional fulfillment. Some humans report that their dangerous pets provide a sense of purpose and excitement that traditional relationships lack. There's apparently something deeply satisfying about successfully maintaining a relationship with a creature that could kill you through miscommunication. The hive mind delegates' voices had synchronized into what sounded like a collective prayer to whatever deities governed rational thought. His primary consciousness was demanding immediate psychiatric evaluation for the entire human species, while his secondary awareness was calculating insurance premiums for interspecies diplomatic missions. Now, Nora said, advancing to what appeared to be her final slide, I realize that everything I've shown you so far might seem extreme by galactic standards. You're probably wondering if there's any limit to the kinds of creatures humans will invite into their homes. The Dean was frantically signaling his assistants, probably trying to determine if there was any way to end this presentation before it caused a diplomatic incident, a medical emergency, or both. Unfortunately, academic freedom was a cornerstone of university policy, and Dr. Whitfield was still technically operating within established guidelines. The answer, Nora continued, is both yes and no. You see, there are certain creatures that even humans acknowledge are too dangerous for casual domestic partnership. Animals so powerful, so unpredictable, and so inherently lethal that even the most adventurous pet owners usually draw the line. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the amphitheater. Finally, evidence that humanity possessed some vestige of survival instinct. However, Nora added, her smile acquiring the kind of edge that suggested the next few minutes would be remembered by historians across 7 star systems, there are always exceptions, and those exceptions bring us to the most fascinating example of human domestic partnership I've encountered in my research. The final slide was loading, and from the expression on Nora's face, the real education was about to begin. The assembled academics leaned forward with the horrified fascination of beings who'd realized they were witnessing either the greatest academic presentation in galactic history or the most spectacular mental breakdown ever recorded. Ladies and gentlemen, Nora announced, let me tell you about humans and their relationship with the apex predators of North America. The holographic display materialized with an image that would haunt academic nightmares for generations. A massive brown creature, easily 8 feet tall and weighing more than most small spacecraft, stood on its hind legs with casual menace. Its claws gleamed like organic daggers, each one capable of disemboweling a human with surgical precision. Meet the Grizzly Bear, Nora announced, with the satisfaction of someone who'd just played their final card in a game everyone else had forgotten they were losing. 900 pounds of muscle, equipped with claws that can shred steel and jaws powerful enough to crush bone. Top running speed, 35 miles per hour. Natural habitat, wherever they damn well please. The amphitheater had gone completely silent, except for the sound of Dean Zethros' stylus snapping under pressure. Professor Slate's crystalline structure was flickering with patterns that roughly translated to "error does not compete." Now, Nora continued, you might assume that humans would treat such creatures with appropriate caution. Perhaps maintain respectful distances, construct substantial barriers, or simply avoid regions where these apex predators reside. Dr. Mortenson's blue skin had progressed to a shade that suggested his circulatory system had given up on life. Please tell me they don't— Oh, but they do, Nora interrupted with gleeful finality. Some humans actively seek out bear encounters for recreation. They camp in bear territory, hike through bear habitats, and photograph bears from distances that would be considered suicidal by any species with functioning survival instincts. The hive mind delegate's 17 voices had devolved into what sounded like a cosmic tantrum. His primary consciousness was demanding immediate evacuation, while his secondary awareness was calculating the probability that humans had somehow conquered death itself. But surely, Dean Zethros managed, his voice barely above a whisper, they don't actually live with these creatures? Nora's smile could have been seen from orbit. Actually, there are documented cases of humans raising orphaned bear cubs in their homes. Some have maintained relationships with adult bears for decades. There are entire communities built in bear territory where humans and bears coexist through what can only be described as mutual respect and shared stubbornness. The Dean was now clutching his desk with the desperate grip of someone who'd realized that everything he'd believed about civilized behavior was crumbling around him. Dr. Whitfield, surely you're exaggerating for dramatic effect. Not at all, Nora replied cheerfully. In fact, there are humans who've successfully integrated bears into their daily routines. Some feed them regularly, others have trained them to perform tasks, and a few have even kept them as working partners in various enterprises. The amphitheater erupted in chaos. Academics were frantically consulting their tablets, probably searching for some regulation that would allow them to flee without violating protocols. The crystalline hegemony's representative was pulsing in patterns that suggested an imminent system crash. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nora announced over the growing pandemonium, "I think this adequately demonstrates the unique nature of human domestic partnerships. We don't just coexist with dangerous species, we actively seek them out, invite them into our lives, and somehow manage to survive the experience." Dean Zethros rose slowly from his chair, his compound eyes reflecting the kind of existential terror usually reserved for cosmic disasters. "Dr. Whitfield," he said carefully, "are you telling this assembly that humans deliberately maintain relationships with creatures capable of killing them without effort?" "Absolutely," Nora confirmed, with the casual confidence of someone who'd just rewritten the galactic understanding of reasonable behavior. "And that's why we keep bears as pets." The dean's resignation was submitted before Nora had finished packing her presentation materials. The amphitheater was evacuated within minutes, with several academics requiring medical attention for stress conditions. The Intergalactic University's Board of Directors called an emergency session to discuss whether humanity should be reclassified as a species of concern. Nora Whitfield departed Nexus Prime with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully challenged the galaxy's assumptions about civilization. Her presentation would become required reading in xenopsychology programs across 7 star systems, though it would forever be prefaced with extensive mental health warnings. The irony, of course, was that every word had been completely accurate. Humans did maintain relationships with apex predators, did invite deadly creatures into their homes, and did somehow manage to survive these arrangements through what could only be described as spectacular optimism and evolutionary stubbornness. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. And somewhere in the archives of the Intergalactic University, a recording of Dr. Whitfield's presentation served as a permanent reminder that the most dangerous creatures in the universe weren't the ones with claws and fangs, they were the ones crazy enough to make friends with them. 3 months after what historians would diplomatically term the Whitfield incident, the Intergalactic University implemented new screening protocols for human academic presentations. The policy, buried in subsection 47 of the revised Symposium Guidelines, required all Earth-based researchers to submit detailed content warnings before addressing interspecies audiences. Dr. Nora Whitfield became something of a legend in xenobiological circles, though invitations to speak at prestigious conferences mysteriously dried up. She returned to Earth to discover that her presentation had been downloaded approximately 12 million times across the galactic network, mostly by beings who refused to believe that any species could be simultaneously intelligent enough for space travel and stupid enough to cuddle with apex predators. The former Dean Zethros opened a quiet meditation retreat on a planet whose most dangerous fauna consisted of particularly aggressive flowers. He never spoke publicly about his resignation, though his memoirs, titled "When Academic Discourse Becomes Existential Terror," became a bestseller in 17 star systems. Meanwhile, back on Earth, humans continued their time-honored tradition of making friends with creatures that could kill them. Bear sanctuaries reported increased visitor interest. Dog parks remained crowded with willing victims, and cat ownership statistics suggested that humanity's relationship with armed predators was stronger than ever. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. Never ask humans to explain their domestic arrangements unless you're prepared for the answer to fundamentally challenge your understanding of survival instincts. Some knowledge, as the revised university motto now read, was too dangerous for civilized discourse, and somewhere in rural Montana, a rancher named Chuck was teaching his pet Grizzly how to fetch the morning newspaper.